the French family, and the French-Eversole feud of Hazard, Kentucky. The French-Eversole feud stands as one of the most violent and extensively documented blood feuds in Appalachian history, occurring primarily between 1887 and 1894 in the mountains of southeastern Kentucky. This conflict centered in the small town of Hazard, often misspelled as Hazard, the county seat of Perry County. While less famous than the Hatfield-McCoy feud, the French-Eversole War was more deadly in a shorter time frame, claiming between 20 and 74 lives depending on various historical accounts. The feud became a national media sensation, with newspapers from New York to California chronicling its bloody battles and dramatic courtroom proceedings. Benjamin Fulton French, also known as Ballard Fulton French or simply Fulton French, was the patriarch and leader of the French faction during this notorious conflict. Unlike his adversary Joseph C. Eversole, who came from an established Kentucky family with roots dating back to the late 1700s, French was an outsider to the region. He hailed from Tennessee, specifically from the Appalachian region of Virginia, before settling in Kentucky. French was a shrewd businessman, practicing both law and commerce in Hazard. He operated a mercantile store that competed directly with Joseph Eversole's establishment in the small mountain town. Through his marriage to Susan Lewis, a Kentuckian, French gained connections to influential families across Breathitt County, Leslie County, and other surrounding areas. This marriage alliance provided him with political and social capital in a region where family ties meant everything. What distinguished French from the native Kentucky mountain people was his lack of loyalty to the local, long-established residents. He was a businessman first, with his primary allegiance to the coal companies and timber interests that were beginning to exploit eastern Kentucky's natural resources in the post-Civil War era. French worked as an agent for these outside companies, which sought to purchase land and mineral rights from the often illiterate farmers who had worked these mountain hollows for generations. Two competing narratives explain the origins of the French-Eversole feud, though historians generally favor one over the other. The more popular but likely fabricated story involves a love triangle. According to this account, a clerk working in French's mercantile store was desperately in love with a local woman. One day, the clerk saw this woman with Benjamin Fulton French, and consumed by jealousy, went to Joseph Eversole with a tale that French had threatened to kill him. When Eversole questioned the clerk about these serious allegations, the clerk remained silent. Eversole warned him that his silence would be taken as confirmation that the threats were real. Initially skeptical, Eversole demanded that the clerk sign a sworn affidavit attesting to French's murderous intentions. The clerk complied, and this affidavit reportedly convinced Eversole that he needed armed protection. He began gathering supporters and arming his clan. French, learning of Eversole's preparations, responded in kind, and the situation escalated into an armed conflict. Many historians believe this entire story was the clerk's elaborate revenge scheme against Fulton French over the romantic rivalry. The more credible explanation centers on business disputes and the exploitation of Appalachian resources. After the Civil War, outside companies began aggressively purchasing vast tracts of land in the Appalachian Mountains to secure rights to the coal deposits beneath the surface. French represented these companies, working to acquire coal rights and timber lands at the lowest possible prices. The problem was that many local farmers were illiterate and had little understanding of the long-term value of mineral rights. They had worked these lands for generations, and the concept of selling underground resources separately from the surface was foreign to them. Joseph Eversole, as a local merchant with deep family connections throughout Perry County, he was related to most of the area's longtime residents, saw French's business practices as fundamentally exploitative. He believed French was cheating illiterate farmers by offering unfair prices for valuable coal rights. Eversole began traveling throughout the county, warning farmers that Fulton French would attempt to defraud them with lowball offers. French, having no ancestral ties to the region, felt no such loyalty to the mountain people and viewed Eversole's interference as sabotage of legitimate business. The resentment between the two successful businessmen grew until both began recruiting armed supporters. French reportedly paid his hired guns between $2 and $250 per day, a substantial sum for the time and place. The French faction, like the Eversoles, favored ambush tactics over open confrontation. This approach offered several advantages. It protected the attackers through concealment, made it difficult to determine who was responsible for specific killings, and created an atmosphere of pervasive fear throughout Perry County. Both sides employed scouts, sentries, and rotating guards to protect their leaders and key positions. French's army consisted primarily of hired guns rather than blood relatives, while the Eversole faction could rely on an extensive network of family members throughout Perry County. The Eversoles, Combs, and Cornett families were deeply intermarried. French had to purchase loyalty. His men were mercenaries, professional fighters who came from places like Grapevine and other surrounding areas. Among the most notorious was Bad Tom Smith, whose name would later become synonymous with the feud's most heinous acts. The First Skirmish, June 1887. The first significant armed confrontation occurred in June 1887. French had left Hazard, possibly to recruit additional fighters. Eversole, learning of French's departure, withdrew most of his forces and left only a skeleton crew in town. He anticipated that French would attack upon his return, planning to spring his own ambush. However, neither side was fooled by these tactical maneuvers. When French finally re-entered Hazard with his armed men, Eversole moved to intercept him. The two sides engaged in a shootout in the middle of town, but only one of French's men was wounded. After a day of sporadic gunfire and standoff, French's forces withdrew from Hazard. The temporary peace, summer 1887. Throughout the summer of 1887, this pattern of cat-and-mouse confrontations continued. The financial strain of maintaining private armies began to drain both men's resources. They were spending cash daily to keep their hired guns in the field, and both owned substantial land holdings in Perry County that they could not liquidate quickly. Eventually, both sides agreed to meet at Big Creek to negotiate a peace settlement. The peace agreement was formal, written, signed, and witnessed by neutral parties. Its terms required both sides to return home, disband their armies, and surrender their weapons to Judge Josiah Combs, who was Eversole's father-in-law. However, the underlying grudge remained unresolved. Soon after their funds were replenished, French accused Eversole of retrieving his surrendered weapons from Judge Combs and failing to fully disband his army. Eversole countered that French had not witnessed him taking any weapons, that French had also maintained his forces, and that the agreement only required a partial surrender of arms. The fragile peace collapsed. The Battle of Hazard, November 8, 1889. The most famous engagement of the feud occurred on the fourth court day in November 1889. John Campbell, who had assumed leadership of the Eversole faction after Joseph Eversole's assassination, was reportedly intoxicated on Graveyard Hill when he discharged his weapon. A local storekeeper, seeing Campbell shooting, took aim and killed him with a single shot. When people in the courthouse heard the gunfire, they immediately assumed it was related to the ongoing feud and scattered in panic. The Eversole clan quickly seized control of the courthouse, while French's men captured the jailhouse on the opposite end of town. Two French supporters, Jesse Fields and Bob Prophet, managed to escape from the courthouse's second story and made their way to the jail. though they later escaped that night to regroup with the rest of their faction. Jesse Fields and Bad Tom Smith then occupied the strategic high ground on Graveyard Hill. When Jay Knight, an Eversole supporter, attempted to dash across the street with a companion to gain better position, French's sharpshooters cut him down. The Eversoles, finding their ammunition exhausted, retreated across the river. They left Green Morris and one other man along the riverbank to cover their withdrawal. When Fields and Smith pursued, Morris opened fire and struck Fields in the arm. With that exchange, the Battle of Hazard concluded. The assassination campaign. The most consequential killing of the feud occurred on Sunday, April 15, 1888. Joseph C. Eversole, his brother-in-law Nick Combs, and Judge Josiah Combs were traveling to Hyden for the regular term of circuit court, positions both Joe and Josiah had held for years. Judge Combs was riding slightly ahead with policeman Tom Hollifield, who was transporting a prisoner named Mary Jones to Hyden, when Josiah heard gunfire behind him. Turning around, Josiah saw both Joe and Nick fall from their horses. Joe died almost instantly. Investigation revealed that the attackers had been camping for days, waiting in ambush for their targets. Benjamin Fulton French was immediately accused and indicted for the murders, but he fled town with a posse, fearing immediate retaliation from the Eversole clan. No one was convicted at the time, but 7 years later, Bad Tom Smith made a gallows confession. Standing on the scaffold before his execution for an unrelated murder, Smith stated that he and Joseph Adkins had committed the murders under direct orders from Fulton French. Earlier in the conflict, on September 15, 1887, another significant killing occurred in broad daylight on the streets of Hazard. Joe Eversole encountered Bill Gambriel, an itinerant preacher and French supporter, and the two men began arguing. The verbal confrontation quickly escalated into a fistfight. Some of Eversole's men opened fire on Gambriel, wounding him. As Gambriel attempted to flee, another man, reportedly a police officer, shot him again. When Gambriel turned away from his attacker, Joe Eversole drew his pistol and shot him in the head, killing him instantly. Interestingly, Eversole himself was never tried for this murder. Another man was prosecuted instead, with the first trial resulting in a hung jury and the second in acquittal. Witnesses testified that Gambriel had attacked Joe first, which apparently provided sufficient legal cover under the violent customs of the time and place. The assassination of Judge Josiah Henry Combs in 1894 marked one of the feud's final major acts of violence. Combs, who was Joseph Eversole's father-in-law and a respected circuit judge, had served as the nominal peacekeeper and intermediary throughout much of the conflict. In 1894, believing the fighting had finally ended, Combs returned to his beloved home in Hazard. On September 23, 1894, while having a conversation with friends outside his house, assassins hidden in a large cornfield opened fire. Joe Adkins, Jesse Fields, and Boone Frazier had concealed themselves in the corn that was growing in Hazard and shot Judge Combs dead. This murder would have gone unsolved except for Bad Tom Smith's gallows confession. Before his execution for the murder of Dr. John E. Rader, Smith outlined how Fulton French had organized the plot and that Joe Adkins had fired the fatal shot. French was tried and acquitted of the charges. Boone Frazier was never apprehended. Jesse Fields received a life sentence but was acquitted in a second trial. Joe Adkins received life sentences in both trials but served only 8 years before being released. The French faction was also implicated in numerous other assassinations. Elijah Morgan, October 9, 1888. Morgan was Judge Josiah Combs's son-in-law but surprisingly was a French supporter. He was working on a peace agreement with Frank Grace when he was ambushed. The Eversole clan had invited him to Hazard to discuss a settlement, but it was a trap. His murder was widely believed to be retaliation for the death of Shade Combs, an Eversoles supporter who had been killed shortly before when his plan to assassinate French was discovered and turned against him. Robin Cornett, July 1890. Cornett, an Eversoles supporter, attempted to retire from the feud and return to peaceful life at his home. When he went into the forest near his home to cut down a tree, assassins ambushed and killed him. State intervention and the blanket court. By late 1888, Judge Lilly, who was responsible for maintaining law in Perry and several other counties, had reached his breaking point. He dispatched state troops to Hazard, which arrived in early November 1888. On November 13, 1888, Judge Lilly wrote to Kentucky Governor Simon Bolivar Buckner, explaining the necessity of military force and stating that he would not conduct court in Perry County or other affected counties without state guard protection due to the constant threat of violence. The next day, Sam Hill, commanding the state troops, wrote to Governor Buckner reporting that only 35 people remained in Hazard when the soldiers arrived. Many residents had fled the violence. After the troops established order, townspeople began returning. They explained to Hill that jury trials had become impossible because jurors were either related to the feuding clans or too frightened of reprisal to render honest verdicts. The November 1888 court term proceeded smoothly with the military presence maintaining order. The courthouse was burned on July 4, 1890, though fortunately the records were saved. The murder of Robin Cornett in July 1890 proved to be the final straw for Judge Lilly. He returned with state troops in August 1890 for a special court term that would be conducted in a tent due to the destroyed courthouse. This extraordinary session became known as the Blanket Court. Judge Lilly moved quickly, bringing up each accused person and ordering them transferred to Clark County for trial, recognizing that no fair trial could occur in Hazard. Initially, none of the accused were allowed bail. The jail became so overcrowded that guards had to keep prisoners in a guarded tent. Despite the irregular circumstances, the Blanket Court was successful in temporarily suppressing the violence, and there were few incidents until 1894. The feud's true conclusion came not in the 1890s, but in 1913, 19 years after the supposed end of hostilities. Benjamin Fulton French had lived all those years in fear, eventually taking to wearing a bulletproof vest wherever he went. On an ordinary day in 1913, French encountered Susan Eversole, the widow of Joseph C. Eversole, walking with her son Harry Clay Eversole. Harry, then 28 years old, was known as One-Arm Harry because he had lost an arm in childhood. When French politely said, "Good morning, Mrs. Eversole," Harry drew his pistol and shot French in the spleen. Remarkably, Harry was only charged with disturbing the peace and fined $75, a trivial penalty that reflected the community's judgment on the long-standing feud. French did not die immediately from the wound, but over the course of more than a year, his health deteriorated. He finally succumbed to the gunshot wound in 1915, bringing the French-Eversole feud to its definitive close. The French-Eversole feud was extensively covered by newspapers across the United States, making it one of the first American conflicts to receive national media attention in the modern sense. The Louisville Courier-Journal published the first report on June 30, 1886, on page 1, and continued to follow the story throughout its duration. Major newspapers from coast to coast covered the feud. The St. Louis Post-Dispatch. This extensive coverage served multiple purposes. It provided entertainment for readers fascinated by the wild nature of Appalachia, reinforced stereotypes about mountain culture, and also generated pressure for state intervention. The media attention ensured that Kentucky's governors and legal authorities could not ignore the ongoing violence in Perry County. The exact death toll of the French Eversole feud remains disputed among historians. General Sam Hill, in his official report to Governor Simon Bolivar Buckner, stated that the feud killed more than 20 men. However, other historians have suggested numbers ranging from 40 to 74 deaths. The discrepancy likely stems from different methodologies in counting deaths. Some historians include only those killed in direct combat or assassination, while others count deaths from related violence, executions of convicted participants, and deaths from wounds sustained during the feud. What is clear is that the French Eversole War caused more deaths in a shorter period than the more famous Hatfield-McCoy feud, which occurred over a longer time frame. The concentration of violence in the small town of Hazard, with a population of only about 100 at the time, meant that virtually every resident was affected by the conflict. The French Eversole feud exemplifies the complex social dynamics of late 19th century Appalachia. It was not simply a primitive clan warfare between ignorant mountain people, as contemporary media often portrayed it. Rather, it represented the clash between traditional communal values and emerging capitalist exploitation, between local loyalty and outside corporate interests, between established families and ambitious newcomers. Benjamin Fulton French, despite being the nominal villain in most historical accounts, was in many ways a product of his time, a businessman operating within the legal structures of his era, even if those structures were being used to dispossess mountain families of their resources. Joseph Eversole, while defending his community, was also defending an economic system that benefited his own family's established position. Perry County eventually became the inspiration for Hazard County in the television series The Dukes of Hazzard, though the TV show bore no resemblance to the actual bloody history of the region. The real story of Hazard, Perry County, involves corporate resource extraction, legal manipulation, political corruption, and a level of violence that shocked the entire nation. Today, the French Eversole feud stands as a cautionary tale about what happens when legal systems fail to provide justice, when economic exploitation goes unchecked, and when personal grievances are allowed to escalate into military conflicts. The involvement of the French family in this conflict represents one of the darkest chapters in Kentucky's history and a defining moment